There is a particular kind of silence that settles over you when you realize everything you thought you understood about your own life has been a carefully managed performance, and you were never the director. I found the GPS tracker on a Tuesday in November. The mechanic's name was Gary. He had kind eyes and grease under his fingernails, and he held the small black device out to me with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to speculate about other people's domestic arrangements. He set it on the workbench between us like a piece of evidence at a trial, which in a way is exactly what it was. "Someone's keeping tabs on you, love," he said. "This is proper surveillance kit, not some cheap thing you'd order off eBay. Whoever put this here paid real money to know where you are at all times." I stared at it. It was perhaps the size of a matchbox. Matte black plastic, magnetic backing. Functional, professional. The kind of thing that cost several £100s and required a monthly subscription to the tracking service behind it. My hands had gone cold before my brain had finished processing what I was looking at. Gary was watching me with that careful neutrality still in place. He was a man of roughly 60, I'd estimated, with a veteran mechanic's instinct for when a customer needed information and when they needed space. He was giving me both, handing over the facts, then stepping back, his arms folded loosely across his chest, letting me arrive at whatever I was going to arrive at without his commentary. "Do you want me to remove it?" I stood there in that garage in Horsforth with the November wind cutting through the open bay doors and the smell of motor oil and rubber all around me, and I thought about who would do this. I thought about the small number of people who had access to my car, who knew my habits, who had ever expressed concern. That word, concern, wrapped around control like a glove around a fist, about where I went and what I did and whether I was making wise decisions with my time and my money and my life. The list had only 2 names on it. I picked up the device. It was lighter than I expected. You'd think a thing capable of transmitting your location to someone's phone every 30 seconds would have more heft to it, more presence, some physical acknowledgement of what it represented. But it sat in my palm like nothing at all, just a small functional object, just a tool. "Leave it," I said. Gary raised an eyebrow. "I know who put it there," I told him, "and I want them to think it's still working." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they understand something they didn't expect to understand, and he handed the device back to me. "Right you are, then," he said. And that was that. I drove back to Headingley in the gathering dark, the Vauxhall's heating doing its best against the Yorkshire cold, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I now knew. 8 months, the tracking service's subscription history would eventually show me. 8 months of silent, invisible monitoring. 8 months of my 29-year-old life. My movements, my routines, my private geography, being fed in real time to the phones of 2 people who had spent 30 years convincing themselves, and anyone who'd listen, that they were only ever trying to help me. I drove through Kirkstall and up into Headingley in the way I had driven 100 times before, past the familiar pubs, the takeaway places with their warm light spilling onto wet pavements, the leafy residential streets with their Victorian terraces. I had driven this route when I was 19 and coming home from university visits, when I was 22 and coming back from my first grown-up job. I had driven it happy and tired and distracted, and once, memorably, in the middle of a particularly bad week, I had pulled over just past the Arndale and sat in the car for 12 minutes doing nothing at all, just existing inside a quiet space that was temporarily mine alone. And throughout all of it, I had never once considered that my geography was being mapped and stored and reviewed. 8 months. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I want you to understand what kind of daughter I had been, because the story doesn't make sense without it. I had been a good daughter. Attentive, patient, forgiving. I had shown up to Sunday lunches and birthday dinners and community events I had no interest in attending. I had listened to advice I hadn't asked for without flinching. I had smiled through comments that would have made lesser women walk out of rooms. I had been, for the entirety of my adult life, exactly the version of myself my parents had decided I was. Slightly bewildered, financially hapless, perpetually in need of their guidance. The thing is, I had never actually been that person, not even close. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story starts long before that November afternoon in Gary's garage. It starts really in the spare bedroom of my flat in Headingley at 11 o'clock at night, 4 years before any of this. But before I get there, I want to tell you about something that happened when I was 19. Something small that I have thought about many times since, because I think it explains the architecture of what came later better than anything else I could show you. I had come home for the Easter holidays from my first year at university. I was studying computer science at Leeds, and I was, by any reasonable measure, doing well. I had an essay I was proud of, a distinction on my last coursework submission, and the growing, cautious sense that I had found something I was genuinely good at. I was excited, in the specific way you can be excited at 19 when you are discovering what your mind is capable of, and over dinner I made the mistake of sharing it. I told them about the distinction. I explained as simply as I could what the project had involved. Some work with algorithms, with efficiency problems, with solutions that my lecturer had called elegant. My father listened with the expression he reserved for complex information arriving from an unexpected source. My mother was serving salad and not quite looking at me. "Well, that's very nice," my mother said when I'd finished. "Though your father's always said computing is a difficult field for women, lots of competition." My father nodded. "You should have a backup plan, something practical. Teaching, perhaps." I remember looking at them across the table and feeling something close to vertigo, the specific dizziness of having your reality questioned by people who have no information about it. I had just told them I'd excelled. They had heard instead a warning about my future difficulty. "I have a distinction," I said. "For now," my mother said warmly. "It gets harder as you go up. We just want you to be realistic." I had been realistic. I had been more than realistic. I had been excellent, and the excellence had been real, and sitting at that table I understood something I would spend the next decade learning more thoroughly, that their concern was not about me. It was never about me. It was about the story they needed to tell about who I was, and that story had no room for distinctions. After that, I stopped telling them things. I completed my degree. A first, which I did not mention until it was already done, and I was handing them the formal notification letter. And I moved into the working world. And I kept the parts of my life that mattered to me at a careful distance from the people who would have made use of them. I should tell you about the notification letter moment, because it was its own small revelation. I had driven to Alwoodley on a Sunday morning, the letter from the university in my bag, and handed it to my mother at the kitchen table. She had opened it while my father stood at the counter making tea, and I had watched her read it with an expression that moved through several stages I had not anticipated. Surprise, then something that looked almost like calculation, then a broad, warm smile. "A first! Well done, Emma." She had passed the letter across to my father, and he had read it and said, "Yes, well done." And that had been it. The conversation had moved on to whether the new people down the road had done something unfortunate with their front garden. I had driven home thinking about what I'd expected, some acknowledgement, perhaps, that their earlier assessments might have been hasty, some revision of the narrative. But that was naive of me, and I understood, driving through Leeds on that Sunday morning, that I had been naive. The distinction had not prompted a reconsideration. It had been absorbed into the existing story without disturbing it. My mother's version of me required mild bewilderment and grateful dependency. A first-class degree was not a problem she needed to address, because in her version of events I was still someone who needed managing, still someone for whom she was responsible. One good result did not change the fundamental architecture. I had a marketing job that paid £34,000 a year, and a comfortable enough life, and a problem that wouldn't leave me alone. The problem was a gap I kept noticing in data management software, a specific, persistent inefficiency in how certain systems handled real-time user authentication that nobody seemed to have addressed in quite the way I was imagining. I'm not going to bore you with the technical specifics, because that's not what this story is about. What matters is that I spent 4 years working on a solution in my spare evenings, building something that I believed, but couldn't quite let myself fully believe, might actually be worth something. Those 4 years had their own private rhythm. I worked at the kitchen table, or on the sofa with the laptop balanced on a board I'd bought specifically for this purpose, or at the small desk in the spare bedroom that I'd cleared of everything else and kept almost monkishly tidy, as though maintaining order in that small space was a kind of faith. Some evenings, the work came fluidly, one idea connecting to the next, like a line of lights switching on in sequence. Other evenings, I sat for 2 hours and produced nothing useful, and went to bed feeling the specific frustration of a mind that had reached its limit for the day. I got very good at making the transition between the two states, accepting the unproductive evenings as part of the process, not as evidence of inadequacy. That was harder than it sounds. It is a skill that requires practice, that accepting difficulty as data rather than verdict. I want to tell you something about those 4 years of evenings, because I think it's easy to romanticize that kind of solitary effort, to make it sound cleaner and more purposeful than it actually felt from inside. The reality was messier. There were weeks when I was certain the whole thing was going nowhere, when the authentication problem I was trying to solve seemed to open onto further problems that opened onto further problems, like a corridor of doors that led only to more corridors. There were evenings when I sat at the desk for 2 hours and produced nothing useful, and eventually watched television instead, and felt the specific, personal flavor of failure that comes from being disappointed in yourself. I kept a paper notebook, a habit from university, where I wrote down problems and half-ideas, and some pages of that notebook are covered in frustrated crossings out and question marks so emphatic they almost went through the paper. Those pages were as important as the pages that looked elegant and solved. Both were part of the same work. I had a colleague named Priya who was the only person in my immediate life who knew I was building something. She didn't know the details. I'd told her only that I was working on a side project, something technical, something that might or might not come to anything. She was the kind of person who accepted that kind of answer at face value and didn't ask for more, which made her quietly invaluable. Every few weeks, she'd catch me at my desk with a particular focused expression and say, "Project night." And I'd say yes, and she'd say good luck without irony or condescension, and that small ritual of acknowledgement sustained me more than I knew how to tell her at the time. I was careful not to tell my parents. This is important to understand. I was careful not to tell them not out of secrecy exactly, but out of self-preservation, because I knew, with the certainty that comes from decades of experience with particular people, exactly what would happen if I told them I was working on something. My father would have nodded thoughtfully and then suggested I was probably not qualified to be doing whatever it was I was attempting, and perhaps I should speak to someone with more expertise. My mother would have worried, audibly, extensively, to everyone in earshot, that I was overextending myself, that I should focus on the job I had rather than chasing things above my station, that she only said this because she loved me and wanted me to be realistic. And the terrible gravity of their constant, low-level skepticism would have pulled at the project like weather. I'd learned that much about myself. I work better in silence. I always have. So I worked in silence. And 18 months before that November afternoon, I submitted a patent application. And 6 months before that afternoon, a tech consortium in Cambridge made contact about acquisition. And 4 months before that afternoon, 2 weeks, specifically, before my mother made her announcement at the family dinner, a payment of £847,000 cleared into a private account I had opened at a bank in Manchester, with a financial advisor named Diane, who wore sensible shoes and had a gift for numbers that I trusted completely. £847,000. I sat in Diane's office in Manchester on a Wednesday morning and stared at the number on the screen and felt something I can only describe as a vast, echoing quiet inside me. Not joy exactly, though joy was in there somewhere. More like the sound a room makes when music stops. That moment of recognizing what had been underneath the noise all along. Diane was watching me from the other side of her desk. Her office was everything I'd expected from a woman of her professional thoroughness, organized without being sterile, with a small plant on the windowsill and a framed photograph of what I assumed was a hiking holiday somewhere with big skies. She had a way of giving you full attention without it feeling like scrutiny, which was the particular quality that had drawn me to her initially, when I'd been researching who I might trust with something this significant. "Congratulations," she said, and the word was simple and sincere, and it hit me harder than I expected. "Thank you," I said. "What would you like to do next?" I had been thinking about that question for months. I'd like to do nothing, I said. For now. I'd like to invest quietly and live exactly as I have been living. I don't want anyone to know. Diane understood. She was a professional who had helped enough people through enough complicated family situations to understand without needing the details. We set up the structures. We made the arrangements. We ensured that my existing accounts, the modest current account with my salary, the small savings account that looked exactly like what someone earning $34,000 a year would have saved, remained the only visible part of my financial life. Then I drove back to Leeds and attended a family dinner at my parents' house in Alwoodley, and I sat at the table where I had sat 100 times before, and I listened to my mother deliver the line that I will carry with me until the end of my life. My aunt and uncle were there. My aunt was wearing a blue cardigan and drinking Sauvignon Blanc. My uncle was telling a story about something that had happened at his golf club. The roast beef was good. My mother has always been an excellent cook, which is one of the complicated things about people who hurt you, that they can also do things very well. The dining room smelled of gravy and candles and the particular wool of my father's good jumper. My mother had been talking about money. She often talked about money, about the prudence required in managing it, about the people she knew who had handled it well or poorly. And the conversation had drifted naturally, the way conversations at that table tended to drift, toward me. And she looked across the white tablecloth with that expression she had, that particular blend of concern and contempt she had been perfecting since I was roughly 14 years old, and she said it. Our Emma can barely manage her own current account. Imagine if she ever got her hands on real money. My aunt smiled. My uncle laughed, a comfortable, complicit laugh. My father chuckled and reached for the wine. The moment was over in perhaps 4 seconds. Nobody at that table would remember it by the following morning. I remember every syllable. I remember the exact way she said it, the lightness of it, the performance of affection threaded through the contempt, the way it was structured as a joke so that any objection from me would read as being unable to take a joke. I remember the way the candle flame wavered slightly from the laughter. I remember the roast beef going cold on my fork. And I remember sitting with £847,000 moving through private accounts they would never see, and saying absolutely nothing. I smiled. I ate my dinner. I poured myself more water. I performed perfect, mild, oblivious Emma for the entire remainder of the evening. Because here's what you learn when you grow up being underestimated. You learn the value of timing. You learn that the most powerful thing you can do with the truth is choose exactly when to release it. That night I was not ready. But I was getting there. I drove home that evening with the city glittering in the rain, the motorway lights reflecting off the wet road in long orange streaks, and I thought about the word she'd chosen. Barely. Our Emma can barely manage. That particular adverb, not struggles with or finds difficult, but barely, as though I were operating at the very edge of some minimum threshold of functional competence, clinging on by a thread, comprehending by margins, thin enough to be embarrassing. I turned the word over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath. It had been said with such ease, such genuine comfort, as though it were simply one of the established facts about the world. The sky is blue, grass is green, Emma barely manages. I thought about Diane's office, about the number on the screen, about the fact that the money I had made from something I had built alone, in the evenings, on top of a full working day, from an idea I had identified and developed and refined and brought to completion, represented approximately 24 times my annual salary. I thought about what barely meant to a person who had done that. I pulled into my street and turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment. Then I went inside, made myself a proper cup of tea, and went to bed. The GPS tracker was the thing that changed my timeline. After Gary handed it back to me, after I drove home and sat in my flat and let the evening settle around me, I called my mother. I kept my voice carefully confused, slightly frightened, the voice of a woman who has encountered something alarming and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Mum, the mechanic found something odd on my car. He says it's a tracking device I don't understand. The pause before she answered was half a second too long, half a second in which I heard everything. The calculation, the decision, the pivot to the story she'd prepared for exactly this possibility. Oh, yes, darling. Your father and I put that there. We worry about you so much, driving around leads at all hours. We just want to make sure you're safe." My chest tightened. I breathed through it. "You've been tracking my location? For how long?" "Only 8 months or so." And then, and this is the part that still makes something cold move through me when I think about it. Her voice shifted, took on that particular quality of patient exasperation, as though I were an unreasonable child asking unreasonable questions. "Don't be dramatic, Emma. If you had any sense about safety, we wouldn't need to. But you've never been very aware of your surroundings, have you? We're just protecting you from your own poor judgment." I sat very still. "You've never been very aware of your surroundings? We're just protecting you from your own poor judgment." 29 years old. I was 29 years old, and my mother had just explained to me, with perfect sincerity and not an ounce of self-consciousness, that she and my father had installed surveillance equipment on my vehicle to protect me from myself. I thanked her for worrying about me. I told her I was tired. I said goodnight with warmth in my voice and ended the call and sat in my quiet flat in Headingley and felt something inside me crystallize. Not anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. More like resolution. Like the moment when you've been looking at a blurred photograph for years and suddenly it snaps into perfect focus and you see exactly what you've been looking at all along. What you need to understand, what I started to truly understand that evening, is that the tracking device wasn't unusual. It was just the latest and most visible expression of something that had been happening my entire adult life. The pattern had always been there. I just never had such clear evidence of it. There had been the university application when I was 17, and I'd wanted to apply to Edinburgh as my first choice. My parents had spent 3 weeks systematically undermining this, mentioning how far away it was, how expensive, how difficult the adjustment would be, how perhaps somewhere closer to home would be more sensible for someone who'd never lived away before. The arguments were always reasonable sounding, always framed as practical wisdom, never quite framed as what they actually were, an unwillingness to let me go far enough away that they couldn't keep me in their peripheral vision. I had applied to Leeds instead, and in the event, found it excellent, and had not regretted it. But the Edinburgh decision had not been fully mine, and in the small hours of certain subsequent evenings, I had wondered who I would have become with 300 miles of geography between us. There had been the job offer, 4 years into my career, from a company in Bristol that would have paid $12,000 a year more and given me scope I didn't have. I'd mentioned it at Sunday lunch as good news, as a possibility I was genuinely excited about. By the following Sunday, I had decided, after many conversations and quiet worries and expressions of concern from both of them, not to apply. I could not now identify the exact moments at which my enthusiasm had been redirected. That was the skill of it. Nothing was ever said directly enough to argue against. It was managed. The way temperature is managed in a room, imperceptibly, until you find yourself cold without knowing when the warmth left. There had been the relationship, at 26, with a man named Patrick who had been kind and funny and had read books with the same absorption I brought to it, and had made me feel, for the first time in a serious adult relationship, genuinely and uncritically liked. My mother had met him 3 times, and by the end of the 3rd meeting had developed a number of quiet, persistent concerns. He seemed unsettled, she thought, not quite sure of himself. Was he really the sort of man who would provide stability? And of course it wasn't her place to say, but she'd noticed Emma seemed almost too comfortable with him, as though she'd lowered her guard in ways that might not serve her in the long run. Patrick and I were together for 14 months and then we weren't, and the dissolution had many causes, but I know which voice had been quietly adding to the weather conditions of that relationship for its entire duration. The access to their accounts came about because of all these things. Not consciously. Not as a plan, at first. But out of something that had been quietly accumulating evidence beneath my awareness for years. I should tell you about the access to their accounts because that's the part that changed everything I thought I knew. When I was 22 and newly employed and had opened my first proper current account, my parents had insisted on being added as joint account holders. Just for emergencies, darling. In case you get confused or something goes wrong. They were so reasonable about it, so warm, so parental, and I had been 22 and earnest and had let them. When I was 25, I'd opened a new account in my name only, the modest, salary-receiving account that still existed, and in the process of doing that administrative shuffle, My parents had suggested I be added to their accounts in return. Fair's fair, my father had said. We're family. He had seemed to genuinely mean that. I had thought at the time that it was a gesture of reciprocity. It had felt like the first time they were treating me as a peer, an adult among adults, someone trusted with something real. I remember the warmth of that feeling. I want to be honest about the warmth of it, because it's important not to flatten this story into one of simple villains. They were not simply villains. They were people who loved in ways that were entangled with control, who cared in ways that were entangled with need, who gave with one hand while taking, often without knowing they were taking, with the other. The warmth I felt that afternoon at the bank was real, and the thing it was in response to was also real. They were offering something they considered genuine. The problem was never that they didn't love me. The problem was what they needed love to cost. What I don't think he'd thought through was that access works both ways. For the first few years, I'd never looked. I'd had no reason to. Then, about 18 months before the patent sale, something had made me curious. I'm not entirely sure what prompted it. Some comment my mother had made, some instinct that had been quietly gathering evidence beneath my conscious awareness. I'd logged in, almost experimentally, and I had seen everything. Let me tell you what I saw because it matters. I saw the account balances. £340,000 in various accounts and investments. Not a vast fortune by any standard, but substantial, real, present. Not mostly gone, nothing to inherit really. Best not to count on anything. Which is what my parents had been telling me since I was old enough to ask such questions. £340,000, sitting quietly in accounts while they told their only daughter there was nothing to plan for, nothing coming, no family safety net worth counting on. I saw the payment record from 2 years prior. The one where I had scraped together £5,000 from my savings for the emergency roof repair they'd told me they couldn't afford. I had eaten sad desk lunches for 4 months to manage that. I had felt genuinely grateful to be in a position to help them. The roof repair had cost £1,800. I found the contractor payment, clear as day. £1,800 for the work and £3,200 transferred 3 weeks later to a travel agent for a fortnight in the Algarve. They had borrowed my money for their holiday. They had called it an emergency. They had expressed gratitude for what a thoughtful daughter I was, how grown up, how generous. I also found the Christmas before that, when they had told me money was tight and I had quietly downgraded my gift budget and bought them practical things rather than the things I'd originally chosen, and traced a payment to a wine merchant of £480 that had gone out the same week they'd told me about the tightness. The wine had been good, presumably. The Christmas had been fine. I had felt careful and frugal and considerate, not knowing I was performing economies against a fiction. There was also a loan I had given them 6 years earlier, when I was barely 23 and had been in my job for only a year. £2,000 for what my father had described as a short-term cash flow issue, bank bureaucracy, something administrative. It would be sorted within the month. I had given it without hesitation, feeling proud to be useful in a tangible way, feeling adult and capable and generous. I had never been asked to wait. It had simply never come back. I had, at the time, assumed they had forgotten, and the thought of raising it had felt too awkward to pursue. Looking at their accounts now, I saw no record of any such emergency. I saw a pattern of casual, comfortable spending throughout that period that had no relationship whatsoever to a cash flow problem. The £2,000 had been a gift that had been described as a loan, because that framing made them feel less indebted and made me feel more necessary, and I had never, until I looked at these accounts, understood that this was what had happened. I sat with all of that knowledge for a long time before I decided what to do with it. The answer, ultimately, was nothing immediate. I watched. I continued to have access to their accounts. They had never revoked it, which I believe was a combination of forgetting and, at some deeper level, of wanting the option to monitor me if they ever needed to. And I continued to look occasionally, carefully, without leaving traces. I watched patterns. I understood their finances better than they would ever suspect. And I kept my own fortune invisible. You want to know what those months felt like? I'll tell you. They felt like being an actor who knows the audience doesn't know they're acting. There is a particular exhaustion to that kind of performance. But there is also a particular freedom. When you've accepted that you're playing a role, you can play it with complete commitment and still remain entirely yourself underneath. I was brilliant at being their Emma, slightly muddled, financially uncertain, touchingly grateful for guidance. Meanwhile, I was meeting with Diane in Manchester, adjusting my investment portfolio, quietly donating to a literacy charity in Chapeltown, and watching my returns outperform my father's self-managed fund by 11% because Diane operated in this decade. "You seem very calm," Diane said to me once, looking up from a projection spreadsheet. "I've been practicing," I told her. She gave me a look that suggested she understood more than she was saying, and went back to the numbers. My father liked explaining investments to me. He had been doing this since I was roughly 16, and he had a method, a patient, measured, slightly loud method, as though financial concepts were better understood at higher volume. He would sit back in his armchair and explain index funds to me using small words and careful pauses, and his face would take on this expression of benevolent satisfaction, the face of a man fulfilling his rightful role as guide and teacher, as I nodded along with wide eyes. "Oh, I see. So the money grows over time? That's clever." I want to be honest with you. I don't entirely regret those moments. There was something informative about watching a person reveal exactly who they are when they believe they're talking to someone incapable of understanding them. One Sunday in early autumn, he had walked me through something called a balanced portfolio, the ratio of equities to bonds, the concept of diversification, the wisdom of not putting everything in one place. He spoke slowly. He used an analogy involving eggs and baskets. He looked pleased with himself when I appeared to grasp it. "You see? It's not so complicated once someone explains it properly." I had, at that point, been managing a portfolio worth several £100,000 for approximately 10 months, with a diversification strategy more sophisticated than anything he was describing. My returns for the year were sitting at 9.4%. I had just the previous week made a decision about rebalancing that Diane had called sound and well-considered. "Thank you," I said. "That's so helpful. I never would have thought of it myself." He patted my shoulder. My mother had her own version of this. She liked to review my monthly budget. I would bring printed statements from the modest account, carefully maintained, nothing unusual. And she would sit at her kitchen table with her reading glasses and her tea, and she would go through my expenses with her pen, tutting at each one, offering suggestions, explaining to me how a sensible woman managed her money. £45 at Waterstones? Emma, really? Books are free at the library. I would apologize. I would promise to do better. I would accept the corrections with a chastened expression and leave having given her exactly what she needed, the confirmation that I required her management. I never mentioned the £12,000 I had quietly donated to a literacy charity. I thought sometimes, with a private amusement I could not share with anyone, about what she would make of that particular line item. It was at my cousin's wedding in York that I came closest to exposure. The wedding was in September, at a beautiful old church near the Shambles, and the reception was in a hotel that smelled of old wood and good wine. My cousin Rachel was radiant. Her new husband was kind and slightly overwhelmed, and kept looking at her like he couldn't believe his luck, which I thought was exactly the right way to feel on one's wedding day. I had driven up with my parents, which was an error I'd made through inertia. It had seemed easier to accept the offer than to explain why I'd prefer to drive myself. 2 hours in the car with both of them, my mother conducting a running assessment of various family members who would be at the event, my father interjecting to correct her on points of fact she hadn't asked to be corrected on. By the time we arrived at the church, I had been managing my own interior weather for roughly 100 miles, and was grateful for the high ceilings and the organ music that gave everyone permission to simply sit and face forward. The ceremony was genuinely lovely. Rachel's voice shook slightly when she made her vows, and her husband's eyes went bright at the edges in a way that made several people around me reach for tissues. I found myself moved in a clean, simple way, not performed emotion but actual feeling, the uncomplicated kind that arrives when something real and true is happening right in front of you. At the reception, the room filled with music and chatter and the particular warmth of a winter wedding. My uncle, my father's brother, a straightforward man who operated almost entirely without the layer of performance that characterized my parents, had drunk enough champagne by the mid-evening to become genuinely philosophical. He found me at the edge of the dance floor and stood beside me watching the room for a while. And then he said, "You know what I respect about you, Emma? You're doing well for yourself without any help. Not like some people who just inherit everything and still manage to complain about it." He glanced briefly, meaningfully across the room at someone I didn't need to identify. Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow. She had always had a radar for conversations that might complicate her narrative. "Oh, Emma's doing adequately," she said, with the warmth of someone making a generous assessment. "We help her manage, of course. She'd be lost without our guidance." My uncle frowned, the mild, slightly confused frown of a man who thought he knew something that didn't quite match what he was being told. "Really? But didn't she?" "She has a perfectly ordinary job," my mother said, cutting smoothly across whatever he'd been about to say. "Marketing something or other. Pays enough for her little flat. Doesn't it, darling?" She was looking at me. The look contained worlds, a warning, a reassertion of the accepted narrative, a challenge to agree with the version of me she needed the world to see. My uncle was looking at me too, with that faint confusion still working through his champagne-warmed expression. You know that feeling? When the truth is right there on your tongue, when you're holding something that wants so badly to come out, when just saying it would be so deeply satisfying, and also, possibly, a catastrophic miscalculation of timing. I swallowed it. "Yes," I said, with a small, mild smile. "Just my regular job. Nothing exciting." My uncle opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at my mother, then at me, and something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of a question he'd decided not to ask tonight. He drifted away, looking thoughtful. My mother relaxed beside me, her shoulder dropping a fraction of an inch. "I do worry about Simon," she said, watching her brother-in-law cross the room. "He never knows when to leave well enough alone." I nodded. I said, and sipped my water. I watched Rachel dance with her new husband. I watched the way they moved together. Easy, unself-conscious, two people who had found in each other a person they didn't need to edit themselves for. I thought about what that might feel like on a more permanent and domestic scale. I thought about Patrick briefly, and then set the thought aside the way you set down something that is still too warm to hold for long. 3 weeks after Rachel's wedding, everything ended. It happened at Sunday lunch. The occasion was ordinary enough on its surface, the usual rhythm of a meal at their house in Alwoodley, the good china, the careful cooking, the conversation that moved between neighborhood news and family updates, and the gentle, sustained project of managing the image of the family they wanted to believe they had. My mother had been talking about their upcoming anniversary party. 40 years of marriage, a real milestone. I won't diminish that. The venue they'd wanted was charging £3,000 for room hire alone. She described this as highway robbery, which was interesting given that I could see in my mind's eye exactly how much sat in their various accounts. "Of course," she said, serving roast potatoes with a particular kind of aggressive precision that I recognized as the physical expression of grievance. If we'd had a daughter who'd made something of herself, who'd married well, or built a proper career, perhaps she could have contributed. But we play the hand we're dealt. The table was very quiet for a moment. My father nodded. The nod of a man endorsing something he agreed with but would prefer not to have said quite so directly, while also not doing anything to stop it. "We've always supported Emma despite her limitations," he said. "Never complained. That's what parents do. Despite her limitations." I want to describe to you what happened inside me in that moment because it's important and I want to be accurate about it. It wasn't rage, not the hot, immediate kind. It was more like the sensation of a door closing. Final. Definitive. The sound of a decision that had been building for years completing itself in the silence of a few seconds. 8 months of surveillance. Years of borrowed money misused. Years of stolen ideas and credit taken for my thoughts and my strategies and my insights. Years of being publicly diminished in front of family. Years of budget reviews and investment lectures and the sustained practice performance of my own incompetence. And now, sitting across a table from both of them, Hearing the word limitations applied to me with such perfect ease, such complete comfort, such total absence of self-awareness. I felt something crystallize in my chest. Hard, clear, final. And I felt beneath that a profound and settling calm. "I need to talk to you both," I said. My voice was quiet, very steady. "Privately. Now." The word now landed differently than I'd expected. Something in the texture of it, the flatness, the absence of the usual apologetic softening I applied to any request that might inconvenience them, made my mother's eyes narrow. Something shifted in the room. "We're eating now," I said again. They looked at each other. My father set down his fork. We went into his study. I remember the study very clearly. The shelves of books he'd always presented as evidence of his intellect, the framed photographs of family holidays and professional achievements, the good desk lamp casting its warm light. It smelled of old paper and something faintly floral, the reed diffuser my mother replenished every month. They stood side by side facing me, and their expressions were matched. Irritation with a current of something harder to name underneath it, something that might have been, if I'm being generous, the first breath of apprehension. I closed the door. The room felt smaller once the door was shut. My father moved to sit behind the desk. As he typically would, the desk was his default position of authority in that room, but then caught something in my expression and stopped himself, and remained standing beside my mother instead. I noticed that. The small recalibration. Something in him understood even then that this conversation would not proceed along familiar lines. I took my phone from my pocket and pulled up a document I had prepared. The document contained numbers. It was, in its way, a kind of account for everything. "I'm going to show you something," I said, "and then I'm going to explain what happens next. You're going to listen without interrupting." My mother drew breath. I met her eyes. "Without interrupting," I said again. She closed her mouth. I looked at them both. Two people I had known since before I had words for knowing. Two people I had loved and defended and performed for and protected. Two people who had built an entire architecture of care around the project of keeping me small. And I began. "I sold a software patent 4 months ago for £847,000. The money is in private accounts that you don't have access to and never will. I have been independently wealthy since October." The silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever heard in that house. More complete than the silence after arguments. More complete than the silence of early Christmas mornings. The kind of silence that has weight to it, physical presence, that presses against the walls of the room. My mother's face had gone very white. My father had stopped breathing, or had at least stopped breathing visibly. I could see the information landing on them, could almost track the progress of it, the initial incomprehension, the instinct to dismiss, the moment that instinct ran up against the specificity of the number. The way specificity makes things real in a way that generalities cannot. I continued. "I've also had access to your bank accounts for the past 4 years. Yes, still. You forgot to remove it or chose not to, and it doesn't matter which because I've used the time well. I've seen every transaction. I know about the £340,000 you told me had mostly disappeared. I know that the roof repair cost £1,800, not $5,000. I know where the remaining $3,200 went. I know everything." My father's mouth opened, closed. He looked, in that moment, like a man watching the floor give way beneath him. "I found the GPS tracker you put on my car 8 months ago," I said. "I left it there. I wanted to see what else you'd do. I wanted to see how far this went." "Emma." My father's voice came out strangled. A register I had never heard from him before, something between disbelief and the beginning of genuine fear. "Emma, sweetheart, we can explain." "I don't want explanations. Please listen." I said I don't want explanations. I said it without heat, without performance. As plain statement of fact. "I want you to understand something very clearly." I looked at my mother first, then my father, then back at my mother. I wanted them both to feel individually seen, individually accountable. "You treated me like a child who couldn't be trusted, like someone with limitations. You monitored my movements, lied to me about money, used my savings for your holiday, took credit for my ideas, and managed my life according to a version of me that only existed in your imagination. And during the entire period of time that you were doing all of this, every Sunday lunch, every budget review, every patient explanation of how investment funds work, I was more successful than you ever imagined I could be. The room seemed to contract. My mother's hand had come up to her collarbone, a gesture I recognized. She made it when she was frightened and trying not to show it. "We were protecting you," she said. Her voice had a quality now that I had never heard from her either, a kind of thinness, like paper held up to light. "We've always protected you. You were controlling me." I said it cleanly, with no excess emotion attached. There's a difference. The word for what you were doing is not protection, it's control. I understand that you may not have fully known the difference, but I need you to know it now. Emma, please. My father's face had moved beyond fear into something rawer, desperation, or the beginning of grief, or perhaps the first moment of truly understanding what he was losing. We're family. We've made mistakes, yes, but that's what families do. We can work through this. Whatever we did wrong, we can talk about it. You can't just... We've always been there for you. We love you. Have you? I asked. And I said it without challenge, genuinely. It was a real question. Have you been there for me? Or have I been there for you while you convinced yourselves it was the other way around? He had no answer for that. The silence where his answer should have been said everything. My mother switched then. I watched her make the calculation and choose a different approach. Softer, warmer, leaning toward intimacy rather than authority. She took half a step forward, and her voice changed. "We love you," she said. "We have only ever wanted what's best for you. You know that, don't you? 40 years we've been married, and you're our only child. You can't throw that away over a misunderstanding. It would break my heart, Emma. It would absolutely break my heart." I had been watching for that move. I had known it would come, because I knew her. Because I had spent 29 years learning the grammar of how she operated. The pivot to love, deployed at exactly the point where logic and justification failed. Love as a trump card. Love as a mechanism of debt. I felt compassion for her in that moment. Real compassion. The kind that doesn't require you to give someone what they want. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "It's a pattern. One that's been building for a very long time. And here's what you should have known, should have done, and need to remember." I felt remarkably calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've stopped fighting the current and instead become still enough to see where it's going. You should have known that intelligence isn't measured by how well someone performs the helplessness you expect from them. You should have done the bare minimum of treating your adult daughter like a person with autonomy and capability, and you need to remember that the people you underestimate are often the ones seeing you most clearly. The room was absolutely still. My mother's eyes were bright with tears she wasn't quite letting fall. My father was looking at the floor, and I felt the specific, irreversible quality of the moment. The way certain conversations are hinges, and after you pass through them, you cannot return to the room you came from. "What are you saying?" my mother asked. Her voice was very small. "What does this mean?" "It means I'm done," I said. Simple. True. Like pulling a splinter. No more Sunday lunches, no more budget reviews, no more guidance. You're not my financial advisors, you're not my guardians, you're not my managers. I'm removing you from my life. You can't. I can. I am. I slid my phone back into my pocket. The tracking device will stop working when I leave here today, because I'm having the car serviced tomorrow and the mechanic will remove it. You'll no longer know where I am, what I'm doing, or how I'm spending my money. You'll have no access, no information, no control over any part of my life. Emma, we're your parents. I looked at my father. His face had crumpled in a way I had never seen before. He looked, in that moment, genuinely old and genuinely lost, and I want to be honest about this. I felt a complicated grief for the father he might have been, and could not be because of who he had chosen to be instead. There is a particular sadness in loving the version of someone that they never quite managed to become. I sat with that sadness briefly, acknowledged it, and set it down. Then you should have acted like it, I said. That was all. I turned and walked out of the study and down the hallway and through the front door, and I did not look back. The afternoon air was cold and clean, and the street was quiet, just the sound of distant cars and a robin, somewhere in the neighbor's hedge, singing a completely ordinary November song. I sat in my Vauxhall for a moment, let the silence settle around me, started the engine. They could watch that final journey on their GPS if they wanted. Tomorrow morning, Gary would remove the device, and that would be the last data point they ever received. I drove back to Headingley, and I made a cup of tea, and I sat in my flat with the lights on against the dark, and I waited for the feeling that I imagined would arrive. The guilt, the doubt, the voice saying I'd been too harsh, too cold, that family was family, that I should have given them a chance to respond, to apologize, to explain themselves into some version of events I could live with. I waited. It never came. What came instead was something I hadn't expected and couldn't have named in advance. The closest word for it is peace. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was there too, underneath, like a warmer layer beneath the surface. Peace. The particular quality of silence that descends when you stop performing. Stop translating yourself for an audience that had already decided what you meant. Stop making yourself fit a shape that was never yours. I was myself, in that flat, on that evening, for the first time in years. Possibly for the first time ever. The calls started 2 days later. My mother first, twice a day for a week. Then escalating to 4 times. Her messages cycled through outrage. How dare you speak to us that way after everything we've done? And pleading, please call me back, I'm worried about you. And what I can only describe as auditing, the tone of a person running through the inventory of their grievances and finding them insufficient, switching tracks, trying again. My father's messages were more consistent. Apologies, increasingly desperate, the voice of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, the precise nature of what he stood to lose. I listened to every message once. I did this deliberately. I thought I owed them that much, the acknowledgement that their words had been received, even if I was not going to act on them. Some of the messages were genuinely painful to hear, particularly my father's. There were moments in them that sounded like a man who was genuinely seeing himself clearly, possibly for the first time, and the sounds that come from that kind of recognition are not comfortable things to hear in another person. But recognition alone, without the time and sustained effort to change what produced the need for recognition, that is not yet enough. I had offered consequences because I believed in consequences. I still do. One message from my mother, the 14th as it happened, 3 weeks in, shifted in tone entirely. Gone was the outrage and the pleading. What replaced them was something quieter, something I had almost never heard from her, an admission. She said she had been thinking. She said she understood that she had treated me in ways that were not right. She said she knew now that the tracking device had been wrong. The word wrong sat in that message like something foreign, something her voice had never been asked to carry in quite that way before. It lasted approximately 40 seconds of a 3-minute message, and then the rest of the message returned to more familiar territory. But those 40 seconds stayed with me. I did not call back. The 40 seconds mattered, and I held them with genuine care, but they were not yet a changed pattern. They were a moment of clarity in a person who had spent decades building a particular way of being. And clarity is the beginning of change, not the evidence of it. Perhaps, given sufficient time and distance and honest reflection, something different could eventually grow from it. I did not close that door entirely in my heart, but I did not open my door either, not yet, possibly not ever. And I accepted both of those possibilities with equal steadiness. I did not call back. I did not respond to the texts. After 10 days, I blocked both numbers. A week after that, my uncle called. "I don't know what happened," he said, "but your mother is devastated. Your father can barely get a word out. Can you at least tell me—" "Ask them about the tracking device," I said. "Ask them what they spent the 5,000 pounds on." He was quiet for a long moment. "Emma—" "Ask them," I said, not unkindly. Just ask them. You can draw your own conclusions. He didn't call back. I think he asked. I think he heard the answers. I think he drew his conclusions. In December, I moved. The new flat was in Chapel Allerton, a little further from the city center, a bit more space, with high ceilings and better light, and a small garden that would be overgrown until spring, and then entirely mine to decide what to do with. I moved my books in first. Unpacked them into new shelves I'd bought specifically for this flat, arranging them in an order that made sense only to me, requiring explanation to nobody. The removal company I hired were two men named Darren and Pete, who worked with extraordinary efficiency and a radio playing classic rock, and they treated my belongings with more care than I'd expected and finished an hour ahead of their estimate. I tipped them well, and they seemed genuinely surprised by it, which told me something about how people generally treated them. I made a note to myself about that, about the small adjustments you can make to the lives of people around you when you have the means and the attention to bother. It was one of the things the money had quietly changed. Not what I bought for myself, but what I was able to give without it costing me anything I couldn't absorb. Moving house has a particular quality when you are doing it entirely on your own terms, with your own resources, answerable to nobody about what you choose to bring and what you choose to leave behind. I gave away 2 carloads of things I'd kept out of obligation, a set of china from my mother that I had never liked, a lamp that had been chosen more for their taste than mine, several items of furniture that had felt like their choices rather than mine. I kept the things that were actually mine, the books, the small print I'd bought years ago from a market in Leeds that my mother had called gloomy but which I had always loved, a gray winter seascape with a quality of light in it I found consoling, the coffee machine I'd bought as my first real celebration of the patent money. I kept the tracking device on the windowsill for a while. I didn't quite know why, except that it seemed important to see it there. This small black object that had represented, for so long, the active surveillance of my own life, now powerless, now just a piece of plastic in a room that belonged to me. I looked at it every morning when I made my coffee. One day in February, I dropped it in the recycling bin without ceremony. It had served its purpose. It had told me everything I needed to know. My life, in the months that followed, became something I had always suspected it could be, but had never been permitted to fully experience. I changed jobs, to a position that paid better, valued what I brought to it, and didn't require me to perform a particular version of myself to be acceptable. I invested in my future with the care and intention it deserved. I donated to causes that mattered to me, the literacy charity in Chapeltown, a mental health organization, a local shelter, small businesses in parts of the city I believed in. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I want to be clear about this, because I've never been interested in excess, and the money had never been about the money. It had been about the knowledge that I had built something real and important, and entirely my own. The money was just the material proof of what I'd always privately known about myself, that the person my parents had been describing for 30 years bore no relationship whatsoever to who I actually was. So I bought books. I bought art. 2 paintings and a photograph from local artists I'd admired for years. I bought a truly excellent coffee machine that grinds the beans fresh and fills the flat with a smell that still, months later, manages to feel like a small, daily victory. I lived as myself, openly, without apology or permission, and the sensation of that, of inhabiting my own life with my own intelligence and my own judgment, was better than anything I can adequately describe. The new job came about through a contact I'd made at a conference I'd attended in my own time, at my own expense. One of those professional development events I'd never mentioned to my parents, because I'd known my mother would manage, within 3 sentences, to turn my attending a conference into evidence of inadequacy, of reaching above myself, of spending money poorly. I had gone in October, listened carefully, had 2 excellent conversations at the evening drink session, and had been contacted 6 weeks later by a company whose work I'd respected for years. The salary was £49,000, with a clear structure for progression. I accepted on a Thursday morning and walked back into my existing office that afternoon, and sat at my desk with the quiet knowledge that I would not be sitting there much longer, and felt the particular peace of a decision already made. I gave my notice the following Monday. My manager asked if there was anything they could do to keep me. I thanked him and said no. He seemed disappointed but not surprised, which I took as its own kind of compliment. Friends noticed. The ones who'd known me for years started commenting that I seemed different, lighter, somehow. More present. One of them, Kate, who'd been my friend since university and had always seen through me more clearly than most, took me for dinner in February and asked me directly what had happened. I told her everything. I watched her expression move through disbelief and outrage and finally a kind of fierce, quiet solidarity that I had not realized I needed until I felt it. "The tracking device," she said, when I'd finished. "They actually installed a tracking device." "On a 29-year-old, I said. "Yes." "And you found it and just left it there?" "For 3 weeks." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she started to laugh. Not at me, but at the sheer audacity of it, the patience of it. And I started laughing too, and it was the best laugh I'd had in years, the kind that comes from somewhere real. "What happened to it?" she asked. "Recycling bin," I said, "in February." "Good," she said, and picked up her wine. We sat there in that restaurant with the candles and the hum of other people's conversations all around us. And Kate looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, or perhaps I had seen it and had not quite been able to accept it, because accepting it would have required accepting something about my own worth that I had been quietly talked out of for too long. The expression said, "I always knew." And I found, to my surprise, that my eyes were wet. "I need to tell you something," Kate said, setting down her glass. "And I need you to not be angry with me for not saying it sooner." I waited. "I watched your mother diminish you for years, at dinners, at parties, at Rachel's wedding, and I never said anything because you always seemed to just absorb it and move on, and I didn't want to make it worse by naming it out loud when you hadn't. But I saw it. I saw it every time. And I want you to know that everyone in that room at the wedding, the people who matter, they saw it too, and none of them believed her version, not the ones worth believing." I held that for a moment. There is something both painful and necessary about learning that people you trusted saw a truth you couldn't fully see yourself and chose to wait until you arrived there independently. Kate had made the right call. Naming it before I was ready would not have helped me, and might have made it easier to dismiss. But the knowledge that she had been watching and had held it carefully and had waited, that landed somewhere important. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just drink your wine." I did. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Truthfully, I really am. I think about those months now with a particular quality of attention. I think about what it meant to watch people believe so completely in their own version of me that they would not, see what was actually standing in front of them. My parents had built a story about who I was, and that story had served them so well, had organized their sense of themselves as necessary and wise and protective, that any evidence contradicting it had simply been absorbed and reinterpreted rather than acknowledged. I think this is more common than most people want to admit. The stories we tell about the people we love, or the people we claim to love, are often stories about ourselves, told at their expense. The parent who needs a struggling child, the friend who needs someone to advise, the partner who needs someone to manage. These relationships have real feeling in them, real attachment, but beneath the feeling is a structure that serves the narrator, not the subject. The GPS tracker was just the most literal expression of something that had been abstract for years. The impulse to keep track of me, to know where I was, to maintain oversight, to ensure I remained within the boundaries of their understanding of me, was the same impulse that had produced every budget review and investment lecture and public diminishment. The technology was new, the need was not. There is research on this. Studies on family enmeshment, on covert control in ostensibly loving relationships, on the way that overprotective parenting styles can persist into the adulthood of children in ways that actively undermine those children's development and self-conception. What the research consistently shows is that the most damaging element isn't any single action. It's the sustained, low-level message that the person being protected cannot trust their own judgment. That message, delivered over years with apparent affection, does something to a person's relationship with their own capacities that is difficult to undo. What I know, from my own experience, is that undoing it is possible. And the undoing begins the moment you stop performing the role that was written for you. It begins the moment you decide. And this requires real courage, the quiet kind, the kind that nobody around you may even recognize as courage. That the story someone else has told about you is not the story you are living. It begins when you stop asking their permission to be what you already are. I want to be careful here, because I'm aware that the version of this story I've been able to tell is one where I had material resources that gave me options. The patent money meant I didn't need their approval for my financial security, and I am not naive enough to pretend that didn't matter. For people in situations with fewer material options, people whose financial entanglement with controlling family members goes deeper than mine did, who can't simply step back because the stakes of doing so are survival level rather than comfort level. The calculus is different and harder, and I don't want to gloss over that. What I can say is that the internal shift and the recognition of the pattern for what it was, the decision to stop performing the role, happened before the money, not because of it. The money made the external consequences of the shift more survivable. The shift itself was something I had to find my way to on my own, in the evenings at the kitchen table, in the quiet accumulation of years of watching and noticing, and slowly trusting what I saw. That internal shift is available to anyone. The specific shape of what you do with it has to be yours to determine. But the beginning, that moment of seeing the pattern clearly and deciding not to be organized by it anymore, that is a thing any person can arrive at, with enough time and enough honest attention to their own experience. Diane and I met in early spring to review where things stood. She slid a summary across the desk, and I looked at the numbers, the quiet, growing evidence of 4 years of work and months of careful management, and felt that same vast quiet I'd felt on the day the payment arrived. Only this time it was warmer, more settled. Less like standing at the edge of something and more like being solidly in the middle of something that was going to continue to grow. "You're doing very well," Diane said with professional understatement. "I know," I said, and meant it simply, without performance, without the reflexive apology I would once have attached to any statement that claimed competence. She looked at me, smiled. "Good. I've been thinking about something else," I told her. "Something new, longer term. I had been turning an idea over for weeks, something in a different space entirely, not a continuation of the authentication work, but something I'd noticed while doing it, an adjacent problem with its own potential. I hadn't told anyone yet. I was still in the stage of listening to it, letting it develop at its own pace." Diane listened while I sketched it out. Not in detail, I didn't have the detail yet, but the shape of it, the direction. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "It sounds like you," she said finally. "Is that a recommendation?" "It's an observation. The best things usually do sound like whoever's making them." I drove back to Chapel Allerton in the early spring afternoon, the Yorkshire light doing that thing it does in March where it's not quite warm, but it's trying. The sky a particular shade of pale blue that always makes Leeds look like a city worth belonging to. I parked in front of my flat, picked up the coffee I'd bought for the drive home, stood for a moment on the pavement before going inside. Somewhere behind me, in Alwoodley, my parents were living their life. My father was explaining something to someone in his careful, patient way. My mother was managing, organizing, curating. The anniversary party had likely happened. I didn't know and had decided I didn't need to. They were existing, as people do, in the stories they'd constructed about themselves, in the absence of the daughter who'd once helped to anchor those stories. I felt something, standing there with my coffee in the March light, that I hadn't expected to feel. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, possibly never in the full uncomplicated sense, but something in that direction. Something that recognized them as people who had been damaged in their own ways, who had learned particular mechanisms of relating that had become so ingrained they could no longer see them from outside. That recognition didn't change what they had done or make it acceptable, but it released me from the need to sustain active anger about it, which is its own kind of burden, and one I had been carrying for long enough. I thought about what I would say to them if I ever did speak to them again. I had no plan for that conversation, no timeline. I simply held the possibility of it, the way you hold something fragile, carefully, without squeezing, without trying to determine yet what you will ultimately do with it. What I knew was that any future conversation would be on entirely different terms than any we had ever had. They would be meeting the actual person I was, not the managed version I had presented for their comfort. Whether they could meet that person, whether they would want to, whether they had the capacity to adjust their story sufficiently to accommodate the reality of me, that was not something I could determine. It was not something I needed to determine. Standing on a pavement in March with good coffee and good light, and a whole afternoon ahead of me with no scheduled performance in it, that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. I was here, in the March light, in front of my own front door, holding my coffee, entirely myself. The tracking device was gone, the performance was over, the money was real and growing and mine, and I had never in my entire life felt more clearly located than in that moment. Not tracked, not managed, not monitored, but genuinely present, genuinely known, to the only person whose knowledge of me had ever truly mattered. Myself. I went inside and made my coffee, the proper kind, from the excellent machine, and sat by the window and watched the garden. The garden in March was still mostly mud and brown stalks, and the ambiguous potential of things that had not yet decided whether to grow. There was one corner where something had already begun, though a handful of snowdrops clustered near the old stone wall, white and improbably persistent, doing what they did every year regardless of whether anyone was watching or approving or considering them realistic. I watched them for a long time. Then I thought about absolutely nothing at all, which is the greatest luxury I have ever known. Here is what I want you to take from this story. If you take anything, the people who most loudly claim to know your limitations are frequently the people least equipped to recognize your capacity. There is psychological research on this. The Dunning-Kruger effect has a lesser-known companion finding, which is that genuinely competent people often underestimate their own abilities relative to others, partly because they assume everyone finds what they find manageable to be manageable. The people who overestimate their superiority do so in part because they cannot accurately assess what they're looking at in others. My parents weren't lying exactly when they said I struggled. They genuinely believed it, because they needed to believe it, because their sense of themselves required my incompetence. But that need was never information about me. It was only ever information about them. The 40% of adults who report feeling controlled by family members in their adult lives often describe the control as arriving in the language of care. That's the mechanism. That's what makes it so persistent and so damaging. Love that comes with surveillance, with oversight, with the implicit message that you cannot be trusted with your own judgment. That's not love functioning as love should. That's love being used as a vehicle for something else, something that serves the person claiming to give it far more than the person receiving it. And the only answer, when you finally see it for what it is to stop receiving it on those terms. To take yourself off that particular grid entirely, to find out who you are when nobody is watching, and then to simply, entirely, be that person. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you had limitations by someone who needed you to have them, drop the word tracker in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you're new here, please subscribe, because we have more stories like this coming and you do not want to miss what's on screen right now, which is a story about a woman who spent 12 years supporting her husband's career, only to discover, on the day of his biggest promotion, exactly what she had actually been funding. The comment section on that one is something else. I'll see you there.